Welcome, GRD131, Graphic Design 1, and this is another public service announcement for fonts of what not to do with fonts. And I just wanted to show you this because I have this exercise that we used to do in class, and we will do an exercise like this where we will fix what I call logo mishaps. And by logo mishaps, it's basically using combinations of fonts that don't really work together because they either don't have contrast or they conflict with each other. Remember we said we want to contrast and complement. We don't want to conflict and compete. Well, a lot of these are having problems like that, and I just wanted to point them out because we're going to do an exercise like this. This is an older one that I used to do in Illustrator, so we'll do something different with our Gravid fonts, but I just want to point out some issues here and see if you can pick these out. This Karen's Jewelers ones we have here, there's a bunch of rules being broken from my previous video, and one of them, well, actually it has the curly quote, so it did use the curly quote, but it's using a script font in all caps. Now this isn't a really decorative script font, but still with these little kind of swashy things that are coming out from the A, the R, all the letters have these swashy things coming out. It doesn't make them flow into the letter very easily, and they're really not meant to go together like that. It's a calligraphic font, and it's meant to have lowercase calligraphy going with it, not meant to be in all caps like that. And then also it's being combined with a kind of a formal looking modern style script font. And I say modern style because it has really thick strokes and really thin strokes like a modern serif font, but it's kind of modern, but it's also very formal. It's not a casual looking font. So you have a mix of styles which compete with each other. In terms of size, they compete with each other in size. The letter forms kind of compete. Nothing standing out. You always want something standing out and something receding. And they're both competing here. So that's an example of what not to do. And we'll go through an exercise where we fix all this, but I just want to point out the things of what not to do. This one over here, Hutchinson Certified Public Accountants. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. Well, there is, but if that was your logo, that's fine. But does Hutchinson really stand out from Certified Public Accountants? No. This should be a lot smaller. This should be the primary focus. This should be the hierarchy, and this should be secondary. In a lot of these type logos, you should have hierarchy. You should have primary and secondary. You should have the host and the co-host. We don't have that here. These are competing. There's no contrast. So if they're competing and there's no contrast, you're breaking the rules. Now, they're in the same font. That's fine. But maybe you need more contrast. Maybe this should be bold and this should be lighter. Maybe this should be smaller and italic and a light italic. Maybe that would set the name off more. So that's one thing that's hurting that. It's breaking the rules because we have no contrast there, because they're competing in terms of size. They have the same weight. Even though this is in all caps and this isn't, there's not enough difference between them to create enough contrast to make this stand out and that be secondary. So they just kind of look like a sign or something. And this one here, Vasco and Vasco, attorneys at law. Well, unfortunately here, attorneys at law is bolder than the actual name. And then it's using this horrible font here that gets overused, this kind of scripty handwritten font. I forget the name as well because I haven't used these fonts in a while, but people used to use these all the time and I used to hate it. But it's not bad, but it's certainly not what you'd want to use for an attorney at law. It's not very appropriate. And attorneys at law is taking the hierarchy over Vasco and Vasco. So you'd have to do something. I'd probably put this in a serif font, very professional, conservative type font, especially since there's attorneys, and then maybe take this one and put it in a sans serif font, maybe make it real small, even spread it out a little like I did on the previous logo. But definitely the combination of these two is not working. The one on the bottom is getting more attention than the one at the top, and they just don't go together. There's not a proper hierarchy of what's more important, and this shouldn't be more important at the bottom. So obviously that one needs to be fixed. And this one, right off the bat, we have two script fonts. Don't want to do that, even though this is like a Western rope-looking thing, squiggly kind of font. This is a little more hand-done, like a fine pen. Just doesn't work at all. Either of these fonts. I mean, it doesn't mean that you couldn't use one of them in a certain situation, but they don't really work together. They compete with each other. There's no contrast. They're similar weights. They just don't work together. It just makes you feel uneasy just looking at it. It looks very unprofessional with the different styles, the similar weights. We have no contrast. We have no complementing. We only have competing and conflicting. So that's what we want to avoid. And down here, Mitchell & Son Forklift Service. Of course, why would a forklift service have their name in this kind of formal scripty font? It looks like a wedding invitation. And then Forklift Service is in a big slab serif font. Now that's fine. You could probably use a font like that, but shouldn't their name be in something like that? And And then the forklift service should be in something secondary, probably not a script font, maybe a sans serif font. Thin sans serif font like an Archivo Narrow or something like that might work with something like that. Mitchell & Son should stand out, that should not. So that's the problem there. We do have contrast, but not in a good way. It's bringing too much attention to forklift service and not enough attention to Mitchell & Son. And Mitchell & Son is in way kind of an inappropriate font. We'll talk about appropriate fonts, but a formal script font probably isn't a good font for a forklift service company. And then finally down here, we've seen this one before. There's the old script font in all caps, which looks horrible. It's hard to read. The letters themselves are more identifiable when they have letters after them. When they're on their own, it's hard to tell what they are sometimes. There's some letters in this alphabet character of this font, of the brush script, that it's even hard to tell what it is on its own. Like the I looks like it could be it has a long kind of thing coming out from it. It doesn't even look like an I when you see it on its own. And then there's a decorative font below it. This is kind of a neat looking font here. It has a light and bold version, but then why not use the light and bold version? Why bring in this script font up here? So this is kind of a fun font for sports and grill, but how about put this in the light font and then put Wally's in the heavy style of that particular typeface? So these are just a couple things what not to do here. All these things here are conflicting and competing, and none of them, for the most part, are providing contrast and complementing each other. Some of these have contrast in size, but weights, there's no contrast in weights here. This one, there's a contrast. It's using the two different categories, but it's not really appropriate for the logo, and the part of the logo that's getting the most emphasis shouldn't really be that part. Forklift service is more the description of what they do. That shouldn't be the biggest thing you see. Their name should be the biggest thing you see. So a lot of things here, what not to do, and believe me, it's not just stuff I make up to look bad. You can look around and look at signs on strip malls and things like that, and you'll see stuff that looks like this, unfortunately. So just wanted to point that out as well. Another public service announcement for fonts. They're begging me, please don't do this to them. Don't put them in these situations.